Alright, so welcome to week 6 of Science Fiction, English 2420, spring 2021. I hope that everyone's doing well, that you're hanging in there with everything else that's going on, not just in your other classes, but in your lives. I hope everyone's well, their families are safe and well. But just to give everyone a reminder, because this is a challenging time for all of us, if anything does come up that you need to let me know about as it might affect your performance, your success in our class, always reach out to me by email. Okay, I don't want anyone to suffer in silence at any point during the semester. And remember, my email address is jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. So in today's class, we have a lot of things to cover. First off, I want to give everyone a reminder to get your scanned copies of your notebooks to me as soon as you can. This was something that is due today. I've received 2 folks' notebooks so far, which is great, but I need to see everyone else's. I've given you instructions, both in the lecture as well as links on our Open Lab site about different ways, different apps you can use for scanning your notebooks. And then I also gave you a link to the Dropbox location where you can upload your notebooks. If you have problems with that, shoot me an email. Let me know what's going on your end. Please, if you do ask for technical help, don't just say it doesn't work. Let me know what it is you've tried and what exactly you saw happen, and then maybe we can troubleshoot it from there. Then we also need to take a look at the syllabus to see what we got coming ahead. And then in today's lecture, we're going to be doing Pulp SF. And so we're going to be talking about it, its founding in terms of science fiction and scientifiction in the pages of Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories. And then your readings for today, which was that one editorial by Gernsback. And then the first part of The Skylark of Space by E. Doc Smith, and then also Shambleau by C.L. Moore. So we'll talk about those. Then we'll recap about the research essay, just to remind people to send me what topics you want to work on. I've already received a few and gotten back to those folks. A lot of interesting things, different things that folks in the class are interested in studying in regard to science fiction. So keep those coming so that I can give you some feedback and make sure you're on a good path toward writing a really just knockout essay for the research project. And then finally we'll talk about homework at the very end of today's class. So to start things off, let's look over the syllabus. So here I am on Open Lab. You got Boba Fett and his friends there over on the left, so you know you're in the right place. And I'm going to go down to week 6 of the schedule. So, week 5, you're reading for today Gernsback's A New Kind of Magazine, E. Doc Smith and Lee Hawkins' Garby's The Skylark of Space Part 1, and C.L. Moore Shambleau. For next week, I have these viewings of Flash Gordon that you can watch on YouTube. And they're also available other places. Archive.org has copies of those very first Flash Gordon serials from the 1930s. And so that's what I'll be lecturing on next week, which will be a continuation of pulp science fiction and how it relates to science fiction serial films, which, as we'll talk about, inspired later science fiction like George Lucas's Star Wars. So that'll be what we're covering next week. So if you haven't done all the readings up to this point, this coming week is actually a good time to play catch up. So if you need to go back and do any of those readings to put into your notebooks, to write weekly writing assignments on, this is a great time to do that. And the same will be true when we have other viewings coming up, such as thinking about week 11, which is where we get to the episode of Star Trek, The City on the Edge of Forever, And this one is more difficult, and I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about it during the lecture. But if at all possible, I would like everybody to try their best to watch that, even though that's not something that we can watch for free online, at least not legally. So the justwatch.com link shows you different streaming services where you can watch that episode of Star Trek. And so if you're resourceful, ask around with friends, family members. You can probably find someone that has an account at one of these services so you can watch it at some point between now and later this semester. So do what you can to watch that coming up for April 21st. But these weeks when we have viewings, those are also times where I had planned in some padding in terms of you doing the readings. Because I know for some folks that it can be difficult to do this amount of reading if you don't have the practice in it, if you're not a fast reader. I mean, believe it or not, I was not always a fast reader. This is something that I've worked at over time through my training, through my education, to get better and faster at. It's not something that you can just achieve with like some trick and be able to do it with the snap of fingers. You really have to work at this over time. So I tried to put some padding in these two places in the semester so that you can get caught up, do all the readings, get good notes, and be prepared for that final exam at the very end of the semester. And of course, to have all this science fiction knowledge in your minds, which to me is like the most important thing. I want you all leaving my class being science fiction experts. But the way you do that is not just by listening to lecture and making notes on lecture, but also doing the readings, making notes on the readings, so that you really internalize these stories, the themes of the stories, the science and technology that's in the stories, all these different aspects you want to experience. And certainly you can like read a synopsis of some of these stories like on Wikipedia or other places, but reading a synopsis, a summary, an abstract is obviously not the same as actually experiencing the story and reading the words and seeing the story unfold in your mind, in your mind's eye, as you read the story itself. So hopefully that'll be of use to you all, but if you have questions about that or if you get behind, again, email me, jls@citytech.cuny.edu, and we'll work things out, and I'll try to help you as much as I can get you back on track. Alright, so that's looking at the syllabus, talking about turning in your midterm notebooks. And so let's go ahead and get into lecture, because we got a lot of things to go over in today's class, because this is where it gets really exciting for me getting into the 20th century. So let's transition from the beginnings of science fiction in the 19th century with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818, followed by the proto-SF work of Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Jules Verne, and then scientific romances of H.G. Wells in the late 1800s and early 20th century. And of course, the critical response to Wells in E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops from 1909. So we're transitioning from those things to the moment when the genre was given a name. But before we name the genre, let's consider what was taking place historically in the early 20th century. First, modern science came into its own through phenomenal theoretical breakthroughs and experimental confirmations. On December 17, 1903, for example, the Wright brothers achieved powered flight for the first time. So there's like this, not only the theorization that went into like how would you achieve powered flight, but then they also actually accomplished powered flight at that time. Then, in 1905, Albert Einstein published what has come to be known as his Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year, papers in the scientific journal Annals of Physics. The first paper explained the photoelectric effect, which alone earned him the Nobel Prize in Physics. The photoelectric effect is obviously very important for solar power, right? That's like a big deal today. The second paper explained Brownian motion, or the random motion of particles in a medium like air or water. The third introduces his special theory of relativity about the relationship of time and space. And then the fourth explores mass and energy equivalence, or E equals mc squared, which is a consequence of the special theory of relativity. Seemingly not having accomplished enough, in 1915 Einstein published the general theory of relativity, which generalizes his special theory of relativity into a theory of gravitation that unifies time and space into four-dimensional space-time. So this is earth-shattering in terms of our sciences in the very early part of the 20th century. But there were more things that were going to take place. Quantum mechanics was established in the early 20th century with Max Planck's quantum hypothesis in 1900 of E, meaning photon energy, equals h times v, h being Planck's constant, times v being the photon frequency. This was another important breakthrough to talk about how energy is quantized, meaning that it's in discrete packets. The term for this new science, quantum mechanics, was coined by a group of physicists at the University of Göttingen in the early 1920s, including Max Born, Werner Heisenberg, who also gave us the uncertainty principle, and Wolfgang Pauli, who gave us the exclusion principle. Erwin Schrödinger further expanded quantum mechanics in the mid to late 1920s with wave mechanics, the Schrödinger equation, and perhaps most famously to most people that aren't physicists, Schrödinger's cat Gedanken experiment. Remember? Thought experiment. To make fun of the now widely taught Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics and all of its weird implications for our understanding of the world. Now, there were innovations in the human-centered science of psychology too. While Sigmund Freud began developing his theory of psychoanalysis in the late 1880s and gave its name in 1896, he lays out his theory in the interpretation of dreams in 1899, which is followed by an abridged version titled On Dreams in 1901. He expands on his theory of sexuality with the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality in 1905. So psychoanalysis is becoming a very big deal, that his school of thought begins to branch out, and people begin practicing and using his theories around the world to help treat people. There were also new innovations in management and industrial production, notably the assembly line in 1901 and the moving assembly line to build the Ford Model T in 1913. Along with this was the beginnings of automobile culture in the US as well as around the world. The biggest cultural development during this time is what is known as Modernism. And here I'm showing Pablo Picasso's Guernica from 1937. The painting depicts the Nazi bombing of the Basque country town of Guernica in northern Spain during the Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1935 to 1939. Now, modernism began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it could be said to continue into the 21st century, but alongside other movements such as postmodernism, which we will talk about in a future lecture. Now, modernism is a movement encompassing art, literature, music, architecture, and philosophy. At its core, according to the poet Ezra Pound, is the concept of make it new. New art, new thinking, new social relationships, etc. It is a reaction to the past and a reckoning with the new scientific, industrial, and social changes taking place in the 20th century. In particular, it could be said to respond to the increasingly industrialized world and the place of the individual in that world, one in which the individual is reconfigured as a cog in the machine. In art, there is cubism, surrealism, Dada, and abstract art. Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier were creating innovative buildings, and there was the beginnings of skyscrapers in metropolitan cities. In literature, there is experimentation with new techniques, including stream of consciousness. Some important works include Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time from 1913 to 1927, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, 1915, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland from 1922, William Carlos Williams' Spring and All, 1922, James Joyce's Ulysses, 1922, E. Cummings' Tulips and Chimneys from 1923, F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, 1925, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway from 1925, John Dos Passos's Manhattan Transfer from 1925, William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury from 1929, and Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, 1929. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you about this context that science fiction kind of emerges with its own name, and I'm not expecting you to capture all of this. But I'm hoping that by naming some of these different authors and their works and some of these details, that it might trigger some things that you've already encountered, maybe in English classes, science classes, history classes, and there may be things you want to look up on your own because they may sound interesting to you, or you just want to find out more about them. So again, with your note-taking, capture what you can, capture what you think is important, the highlights, and those things that I think really stand out that you need to put in your notes. I'll point those out when we get to the science fiction section in a moment. Now, some other final things about context is also keep in mind that motion pictures have their first public screenings in 1895. Silent films gained a following through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Sound was introduced to film in the 1920s, and then color was added in the 1930s. Then also radio, or wirelessly broadcasting and receiving sound, was invented and improved upon during the 1800s, but it was really developed by hobbyists, enthusiasts, and inventors in the early part of the 20th century. Radio development at that time can be seen as analogous to the personal computer hobbyist movement in the mid to late 1970s that led to the development of the Altair 8800, the MSI 8080, and the Apple I. In fact, the radio hobbyist scene was instrumental to the beginnings of the pulp science fiction publishing phenomenon, as we will see shortly. There were significant upheavals in the world due to wars and disease, too. The First World War, which lasted from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918, introduced new ways to kill and maim, and its aftermath laid the groundwork for the mid-century Second World War. As soldiers returned home from the First World War, they inadvertently spread a deadly strain of the flu, known as the Spanish flu pandemic, which killed tens of millions of people around the world between 1918 and 1919. And it should be noted that people at that time were also wearing masks as a way to prevent the spread of the disease. Then the Great Depression began with the stock market crash of October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, and its effects lasted through the decade. Business failures, massive unemployment, drops in production, drops in crop prices, and few social safety nets to help people. Also, considering worldwide developments, there was the Russian Revolution of 1917 to 1922, which led to the founding of the Soviet Union. And then Sun Yat-sen helped establish the Democratic Republic of China after the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, which punctuated 5,000 years of monarchy in China. And of course, this is all laying the groundwork for big developments that happened in the mid-century that we'll talk about later. So it was out of these big scientific, technological, and social changes at the beginning of the 20th century that science fiction came into its own. Now, the pulp science fiction, or pulp SF, remember when we abbreviate science fiction, it's just capital S, capital F. So pulp SF. So the pulp science fiction, or pulp SF era, was roughly from the 1920s to the 1930s. The name comes from the type of magazines and how those magazines were made. They measure about 10 by 7 inches. And they are printed on cheap paper made from chemically treated wood pulp, which is a process invented in the 1880s. Pulp paper is coarse, very absorbent, it's acidic, and it's very thick. Due to the way pulp paper's acid content it ages badly. Like over time, that acid in the paper just naturally breaks the paper down. It becomes yellow and brittle. However, these magazines feature brightly colored covers that were meant to attract the attention of passers-by of magazine shelves. Writers for the pulps were paid very cheaply by the word. This leads to a certain kind of less than stellar writing style because writers aim to get paid as much as possible for the least time writing as possible, which means that you put in a lot of filler and a lot of repetition in order to try to maximize your word count without having to expend too much time actually writing the story. So stories were churned out as quickly as possible. And when I'm talking about paid by the word, we're talking fractions of a cent, okay, early on. Now, Pulp SF has 8 characteristics that you should know. First, exciting stories full of action, romance, heroism, success, exotic settings, fantastic adventures, and usually a happy ending. Okay, so that's the first characteristic. Exciting stories full of action, romance, heroism, personal success, exotic settings, fantastic adventures, and usually a happy ending. The second characteristic is that it's stylistically crude, but there are some exceptions, such as the writer Jack London, who you might know as the author of White Fang. Third, they're typically formulaic or follow a certain pattern in many stories. So like if you read one story and then you pick up a story by another author, the pattern of the story is very similar. The names may be changed, the setting might be changed, but it's kind of the same plot points being repeated over and over. Formulaic. 4, they were written for a less educated audience, or put another way, they aim to the lowest common denominator of the audience. And again, this was to try to get as many sales as possible. More of an audience. Fifth characteristic is that there was little emphasis on character, and they were often drawing on stereotypes, which we'll talk about in particular with the Skylark of Space today. 6, many recycled ideas from one story to the next, which is actually good for the genre because some of those ideas that get recycled allowed for authors that borrowed those ideas not to have to explain everything again because they would know that their audience would have already read about them in earlier stories by other people. For example, like, a ray gun or a jetpack or a hyperdrive. These things became a part of what's been called the megatext of science fiction. These shared ideas that get recycled by different authors, by different creators of science fiction. The seventh characteristic are BEMS, B-E-M-S, all capital letters, BEMS. And that stands for bug-eyed monsters. Bug-eyed monsters. A lot of bug-eyed monsters, as in the aliens, the bad guys. And then the eighth characteristic is specific SF themes were developed during this time. Galactic empires, themes of heroes, optimism and pessimism, sex, space opera, which we'll talk about today. Superman came out of this era, first as a science fiction story, which then later they turned into a comic book. But just as like an aside, one thing about the original Superman story is that the original Superman actually used his powers for ill, because I mean he was in a sense omnipotent, and so why not just take over and control everything rather than just serve for some sense of good. But other things that were developed during this time include sword and sorcery, as well as arch enemies and villains. So these are some of the themes that came out of this era. Now, this person that I have on the screen right now is the one person we identify as the innovator of Pulp SF and the person responsible for giving science fiction a label. His name is Hugo Gernsback. So make sure you get this into your notes. His name is spelled H-U-G-O, Hugo Gernsback, G-E-R-N-S-B-A-C-K. And Hugo Gernsback was born in 1884 and he died in 1967. 1884 to 1967. Gernsback was a Luxembourg-born writer and editor who immigrated to the United States in 1904 and wound up in New York City. Drawing on his interest in electricity and radio, he launched an electronics mail-order company and a magazine meant to drive customers his way, called Modern Electrics, in 1908. In Modern Electrics, Gernsback published his first novel called Ralph 124C41 Plus, and it was published as a serial from 1911 to 1912. And he revised it and published it as a standalone novel in 1925. And I'll mention this again later, but a serial is where you take a novel and instead of publishing it as one thing in like one issue of a magazine or as a book, you serialize it, meaning you chop it up into pieces and put one piece in each issue of a magazine in sequential order. So like you may have one part of the novel in January's issue, one part of the novel in February's issue, the third part in the March issue, for example. And what's good about this, at least for the magazine, is it tries to drive up sales. Because if you like the story you read in the first issue, you'll want to seek out and buy those next two issues to complete the story. It sells more magazines. So this particular novel, though, Ralph 124C41 Plus, is also the name of the story's hero. That's his name, Ralph 124C41 Plus. He is a lone inventor whose work gained him immense celebrity in the 27th century. He uses his inventions to accomplish daring feats, always in the service of saving the girl he falls in love with. Gernsback, thinking that his ideas might inspire readers to buy his electronics gear and build their own inventions, meticulously describes how each invention works. Also, his focus is on the prediction of the future, following after one of his favorite writers, H.G. Wells, who we talked about previously. Therefore, think about the hero's name in terms of like prophecy and of doing good with inventions in science. Ralph 124C for 1 plus, meaning everyone. So Ralph is meant to foresee the future for everyone and kind of lead the way. Now, also Gernsback launched the New York City AM radio station WRNY in 1925 as a means to promote his radio and science magazines. His station also played a role in some of the first experimental television transmissions in the 1920s. Gernsback had written about television technology in his magazines beginning in December 1909 in Modern Electrics. Then in 1928, Gernsback published plans for building television receivers in the magazines Science and Invention and Radio News. But only the most knowledgeable people that were very keen on radio and electronics technology would be able to build those receivers and actually receive a picture about the size of a postage stamp from some of those early transmissions. But there were people that were able to accomplish that. Now, Gernsback launched the first science fiction magazine in the world in April 1926 with the title Amazing Stories. In the first issue, which you read that editorial from, he coined a new word called scientifiction. Make sure you put that in your notes. SCIENTIFICTION. Just one word, scientifiction. And he defined it as, quote, by scientifiction, I mean the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and Edgar Allan Poe type of story. All names that we've mentioned before. A charming romance intermingled with scientific fact and prophetic vision. Not only do these amazing tales make tremendously interesting reading, they are always instructive. They supply knowledge in a very palatable form. New adventures pictured for us in the scientifiction of today are not at all impossible of realization tomorrow. Many great science stories destined to be of historical interest are still to be written. Posterity will point to them as having blazed a new trail, not only in literature and fiction, but progress as well, end quote. Based on this definition, there are three things that you should put in your notebooks about Gernsback's scientifiction. 1, scientifiction is 75% literature and 25% science. 75% literature and 25% science. 2, it's didactic. DIDACTIC, didactic, which means that it teaches. And 3, prophetic. PROPHETIC, prophetic, which means that it foresees and predicts the future. So he sees science fiction as like showing us what the world will be like one day. Now, Amazing Stories was published in the so-called bedsheet size, or approximately 9 by 12 inches. I mean, it's a pretty big magazine. But one advantage of that is it takes up more shelf space, so people will likely see it when there's a lot of other magazines on the shelves around it. Gernsback reprinted Poe, Verne, and Wells, these writers who I've mentioned before. Also, he published work by new writers, including Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Princess of Mars, John Carpenter stories. But you may also recognize the name from his other stories, Tarzan of the Apes. In 1929, Gernsback's publishing company was forced into bankruptcy, and he lost control of Amazing. Soon, he was back with new magazines, though. Air Wonder Stories, Science Wonder Stories, Science Wonder Quarterly, and Scientific Detective Monthly. Gernsback also launched an educational sex magazine called Sexology that had perhaps a more extended run. Gernsback played an important role in the inauguration of science fiction fandom, or the community of science fiction readers and fans, when he started the Science Fiction League in his magazine Wonder Stories in 1934. Fandom is the active readership and invested fans of SF. Unlike most other genres and cultural works, SF has a long history of fans coming together to meet in clubs or conventions to discuss, self-publish criticism and original stories and fanzines, and bestow awards. The first recorded SF fan club meeting was the New York Scienceers, Scienceers, on 11th December 1929. The first convention was held in Leeds, England, on 3rd January 1937. And the first World Science Fiction Convention, or WorldCon as they're known, was held here in New York in 1939. And here's a cover of the very first Amazing Stories. This is from April 1926. And you all read for today's class this editorial. And what's neat about these scans of these magazines, you get to see the magazine the way it existed before it had been digitized. But we're able to experience as close as we can the look and feel of these magazines on the screens of our computers. And you can see here the statue or drawing of the statue representing Jules Verne. This is in Nantes, France. And kind of gesturing upward and toward the future. So this was very important, I think, to Gernsback's thinking of what science fiction is and what science fiction should do. Now, this week's first reading is from the August 1928 issue of Amazing Stories. This issue here that you read for today's class. Not the whole issue, but just the story from it. And it's by E. Doc Smith. That's the way you should write his name is E period, space, then Doc in quotation marks, that's his nickname, Smith, S-M-I-T-H. But the story also has another byline. That's Mrs. Lee Hawkins Garby. Lee Hawkins Garby. And together they wrote The Skylark of Space. And we read part 1 of 3 parts today. Now, when E. Doc Smith first began writing The Skylark of Space, Lee Hawkins Garby, the wife of one of his college friends, offered to help with writing the dialogue and romantic scenes, while Smith focused on the science and technology aspects of the story. Later, Smith revised The Skylark of Space when it was published as a novel, like as a book, and removed Garby's byline. What we read for today's class is the first installment of a 3-part serialization of the novel. And again, serialization means that the whole novel was split into parts, in this case into 3 parts. 1 part published in 3 subsequent issues. The first part appears in the August 1928 Amazing Stories, the second in September 1928, and the third in October 1928. And if you want to read the whole novel, you have to buy 3 issues of the magazine. And something else I'll just note about this novel, and it's true for many novels that were published in this era as serials, is that many of them were not published in book form, like collected together into a single book, until much later. Even like with The Skylark of Space, I would have to check the date, but I think it was the late 1940s, early 1950s before it found its way into published book form, even though it's obviously had been around for a number of years in that magazine, if people were still able to find copies. Now, E. Doc Smith, he was born in 1890 and died in 1965, 1890 to 1965. and he is considered the father of space opera. The father of space opera. So what is space opera? Space opera is a subgenre of science fiction innovated in the pages of Gernsback's Amazing Stories. As a little background, in August 1928, this issue that you read for today's class, Gernsback not only published E. Doc Smith's The Skylark of Space, he also published Armageddon 2419 AD by Philip Francis Nolan. This was the first Buck Rogers story. Now, however, these types of stories weren't yet called space opera. Even both of them are clearly examples of what space opera is. This term didn't come about until a little bit later, in 1941, when Wilson Tucker suggested the term to refer to, quote, hacky, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarn, end quote. Soap operas, radio dramas for women working from the home, did not come about as a term until radio was a widely dispersed technology. Space opera are stories that are high adventure, set in interplanetary or interstellar conflict. But there is that dramatic part to them. Lots of coincidences that we see in other types of quote-unquote operas, like soap operas. Chamblot, which you also read for today, could be considered space opera. Another example that came much later would be Star Wars by George Lucas. Other important early space opera writers include Edmund Hamilton, who lived from 1904 to 1977. And one of his notable stories that you might want to look up on your own is called Thundering Worlds from 1934, in which planeteers strap rockets to their planets to find a new star to orbit after their star dies. So, I mean, literally putting rockets onto planets and flying them through the cosmos. Now, E. Doc Smith earned the Doc nickname for having a PhD. As you can imagine, that was probably a rarity amongst science fiction writers, even though different science fiction writers might have had some background in science and technology. There were few and far between that actually also had PhDs, terminal degrees in science. Though it should be noted, E. Doc Smith's terminal degree was in chemical engineering, and his profession was in food engineering, meaning using science to improve foods, especially processed foods. At the time he was writing The Skylark of Space, he worked as chief chemist for a large mill in Michigan, where he was working on donut mixes. The Skylark of Space began a series of 4 novels, including Skylark 3, Skylark of Verilon, and Skylark Duquesne. The Skylark stories focus on the scientist, inventor, and adventurer Richard Seaton and his rival Dr. Mark Blackie Duquesne. Part 1 of the first novel relates how Seaton and his wealthy friend Reynolds Crane developed Seaton's discovery of how to unlock the intra-atomic energy, or what we would think of as atomic energy, to create a new propulsion system for spacecraft, new electrical energy production systems, and dangerously powerful weapons. Duquesne wants Seaton's invention for himself so that he can become rich off of it. So in part 2, he kidnaps Seaton's girlfriend Dorothy Vaneman and her friend Margaret Spencer. Seaton and Crane pursue Duquesne, overtake him, rescue the women, extract a promise of cooperation from Duquesne to help them return to Earth. They have some adventures in outer space, collecting material for fuel on alien worlds, much like the contemporary video game No Man's Sky, meeting a Q-like intelligence, similar to what we see later in Star Trek: The Next Generation, and finding themselves caught in political intrigue between 2 rival alien races. Eventually, they make their way back home aboard a newly built Skylark II made by their new alien allies. Now, E. Doc Smith is also known for the space opera Lensman, Lensmen, Lensman series, that presents, with an expansive history of the universe, the formation of the Galactic Patrol to enforce intergalactic law, and the creation of the first lens, a technology that gives the Galactic Patrol's leader telepathic abilities to aid in enforcement of the law. However, these stories present eugenics, and that's spelled, and you should put that in your notes, Eugenic, eugenics, as a solution for creating post-human supermen. Eugenics is the selective breeding of human beings to produce certain desired traits, akin to the breeding of animals. Eugenics has a long history in racist ideologies. Similarly, there is racist language and ideas embedded in the Skylark of Space that reflect attitudes and opinions circulating within culture in the early 20th century, and expressed by individuals like Smith, who were, of course, a part of that culture. For example, while Duquesne's nickname is Blackie due to his black hair, but this word is also used as a racist epithet. On page 401, there is the reference to the, quote, old colored couple who were his servants, end quote. Colored people is another term referring to people who are black, used at that time. Then on page 405, there is the phrase, a good Indian, which implies the other half of this terrible phrase, meaning a good Indian is a dead Indian. And in reference to Crane's assistant Shiro, the villains refer to him as, quote-unquote, that Jap on page 406, using the racist label for Japanese. I point these things out to recognize the racism that is present in some of this early pulp SF. We have to call it out for what it is, but I think we also need to talk about it within the context of the historical moment and culture that it was created in. Should we avoid reading works like The Skylark of Space because of its embedded racism? No. I think that we should read them because they had a profound and significant impact on the science fiction genre's development, and we can appreciate the stories in that context while also criticizing and questioning them in terms of their racism as well as sexism and other troubling aspects. Now, another pulp magazine worth mentioning is Weird Tales, which was founded in 1923 by J.C. Henneberger and J.M. Lanzinger. Weird Tales published H.P. Lovecraft, C.L. Moore, and Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian. The magazine hit its stride under the editorship of Farnsworth Wright beginning in November 1924. Weird Tales is known for publishing horror stories, sword and sorcery, exotic adventure, and anything else which its title might embrace, Weird Tales. Now, for today's class, you read one story from Weird Tales, and that was by C.L. Moore. And so the way we typically write her name is C.L. Moore, M-O-O-R-E, but her full name, which you should just put in your notes for reference, is Catherine, C-A-T-H-E-R-I-N-E, Lucille, L-U-C-I-L-L-E, Moore. So C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore. And she was born in 1911 and died in 1987. 1911 to 1987. C.L. Moore gained fame as a pulp science fiction writer with her short story Shambleau. Make sure that you have that in your notes too. S-H-A-M Bleau. And that was published in 1933 in the November issue that we read for today's class. More Chamblot is a femme fatale story set on Mars. She wrote many other stories about the character in the story, Northwest Smith. She's also recognized as the writer of the first sword and sorcery story with a female hero, Jirel of Jory. And that's spelled Jirel, Jirel of Jory, Joiry. Some trivia for you. Moore wrote a crossover story with Jirel and Northwest Smith in 1937 called Quest of the Starstone. It was her first collaboration with her future husband, who she married in 1940, named Henry Kuttner, Kuttner. And he was born in 1914 and died in 1958. And it was published in Weird Tales too. Of the pair, Moore was a writer with fluency. She expressed herself easily and articulately. And assiduity, Assiduity, meaning like she had a keen sense of attention to detail. While Kuttner, her husband, used wit, wrote neat exposition, and deployed ideas. So they each had different strengths that they were able to use together in some of this writing that took place after Chamblot. Now, the thing is that Moore, C.L. Moore, was the stronger writer in the pair, though. But sexism at the time led to Kuttner getting much more of the praise. Moore also wrote for television, but she stopped writing altogether in 1963 when she remarried following Kuttner's death. Another important story by Moore that you should know about, and maybe you could look it up on your own, you could even think about it as an option for your research essay, is her story No Woman Born from 1944. It is about a dancer named Deirdre whose body is terribly burned in a fire. And through technology, she's given a robotic body and she becomes a cyborg. But the story raises questions about how one's embodiment changes our consciousness and our emotions. So Deirdre is the same person in the story, but she's also very different in subtle ways. And so I also want to give you some notes on two other writers that we didn't read for today's class, but I think that you should know about. And that's Edgar Rice Burroughs and H.P. Lovecraft. And then we'll save the rest of it for the lecture next week. All right, so first off is Edgar Rice Burroughs. His name is spelled Edgar Rice, R-I-C-E, Burroughs, B-U-R-R-O-U-G-H-S, Edgar Rice Burroughs. And he was born in 1875 and died in 1950, 1875 to 1950. And Edgar Rice Burroughs is probably most well known for Tarzan of the Apes from 1912 in All Story magazine, which is about a high-born feral child raised amongst a community of apes in Africa, who returns to civilization after falling in love with Jane, a woman he encounters in the wild. And the Barsoom or Martian stories, Barsoom being the name the Martians give to the planet Mars, which includes A Princess of Mars from 1912 in All Story magazine, and follows the adventures of Earthman John Carter, the Red Martian Princess Deja Thoris, and the Green Martian Tars Tarkas. It should be noted that Burroughs' Barsoom stories were inspired by the supposed discovery of canals on Mars by the American astronomer Percival Lowell, who lived from 1855 to 1916. After reading Camille Flammarion's La Planète Mars and its drawings of the allegedly seen canals of Mars by the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli, which I mentioned I think in the last lecture, Lowell built an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona for an extensive study of Mars. In 3 books, Lowell presented his own observations in a series of books from 1895 to 1908 of intricate canals on the surface of Mars, which he believed indicated the presence of intelligent life. Unfortunately, the canals didn't exist. They were disproven by NASA's Mariner missions in the 1960s and early 1970s. In the meantime, the idea of life on Mars captured the interest of many people, including Burrough, who used that idea as the inspiration for his Barsoom stories. Unlike many other successful SF writers, even in the Pulp SF era, Burrough wrote about things that he knew very little about. He wasn't a wide reader, and he had no formal writing background. In fact, he was down on his luck in his 30s, how old he was, when he decided to begin writing A Princess of Mars during the downtime at a failing business venture he started to sell pencil sharpeners. The writer Gore Vidal, 1925 to 2012, described Burroughs' writing as quote-unquote daydreaming. His story's dialogue is poorly developed. His action descriptions, though, are exciting. And there are too many coincidences, many plot developments beggar belief, and there are stereotypes and racist themes throughout. Nevertheless, it can't be understated how much influence Edgar Rice Burroughs had on the next generation of science fiction writers, including Ray Bradbury, who we'll talk about later, and scientists like Carl Sagan. The science fiction author Ray Bradbury says this of Burroughs in an interview shortly before his death, quote, Edgar Rice Burroughs never would have looked upon himself as a social mover and shaker with social obligations. But as it turns out, and I love to say it because it upsets everyone terribly, Burroughs is probably the most influential writer in the entire history of the world. By giving romance and adventure to a whole generation of boys, Burroughs caused them to go out and decide to become special. That's what we have to do for everyone. Give the gift of life with our books. Say to a girl or boy at age 10, hey, life is fun. Grow tall. I've talked to more biochemists and more astronomers and technologists in various fields who, when they were 10 years old, fell in love with John Carter and Tarzan and decided to become something romantic. Burroughs put us on the moon. All the technologists read Burroughs. I was once at Caltech with a whole bunch of scientists, and they all admitted it. 2 leading astronomers, one from Cornell, the other from Caltech, came out and said, yeah, that's why we became astronomers. We wanted to see Mars more closely. I find this in most fields. The need for romance is constant, and again, is poo-pooed by intellectuals. As a result, they're going to stunt their kids. You can't kill a dream. Social obligation has to come from living with some sense of style, high adventure, and romance, end quote. So that was Ray Bradbury talking about the influence of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And then to close out today's lecture, this is H.P. Lovecraft. And so the way we normally write his name is H.P. Lovecraft, Lovecraft. But just for your notes, his whole name is Howard, Howard, Phillips, Phillips, Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. And he was born in 1890, and he died in 1937. 1890 to 1937. So H.P. Lovecraft spent most of his life in Providence, Rhode Island. But he did live for a time in New York, where he was married for some of that time. In addition to writing fiction, he was a prolific writer of letters. Lovecraft contributed to weird tales and influenced the weird fiction subgenre. most of his fiction is known as weird fiction, which has these 4 characteristics that you should include in your notes. Weird fiction, first, is a broad term that describes fantasy, supernatural fiction, and horror tales that embody transgressive material. Embodies transgressive material. 2, motifs of thinning, meaning diminishment or reduction of the protagonist, the health of the land or loss of the land. And motifs of the uncanny, meaning the strange and unusual. So the second characteristic of weird fiction is motifs of thinning and the uncanny. Third, there is occultism and Satanism in many of the stories. Occultism, occultism, occultism and Satanism. And the fourth characteristic is doppelgangers. Doppelgangers is spelled Doppelgangers. Doppelgangers. And this is the definition that Lovecraft I'll explain first. Doppelgangers, this means a double of yourself or a double of someone else. Not like a clone like we think of in science fiction, but this would be like a supernatural doubling of the self. Like if you're like a good version of yourself, your doppelganger may be like an evil version, a mirror version of yourself. Now, Lovecraft wrote this definition of weird fiction in 1927. Quote, "The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space." End quote. Now, that's weird fiction, which is a large part of what H.P. Lovecraft wrote. But there's also a special kind of story that H.P. Lovecraft is known for, and that I want you to put in your notes. And that's called, this thing called cosmic horror. Cosmic horror. So Lovecraft is known as a horror writer, but with his Cthulhu mythos stories, and that's spelled as a strange word that he created. Cthulhu is Cthulhu, Cthulhu mythos. Mythos is like, kind of like a universe. Mythos, or cosmology. Cthulhu mythos stories. Lovecraft attempted to develop cosmic horror with these 5 characteristics. So the first characteristic of cosmic horror is that there are other dimensions where there are other life forms, other worlds, and parallel to our own. 2, invasion by aliens. 3, interference with human cultural and physiological evolution. So it's like there's some kind of interference taking place with human culture and our own evolution as a species. 4th, the universe is essentially horrible and hostile to humanity, meaning that it is a very dangerous place for humanity to exist in. And 5, writing shifts between clinical to dense adjective field descriptions. So like sometimes the language is like, very point of fact, almost like reading doctor's notes. And then it can quickly shift into these very dense passages filled with lots of adjectives describing the danger and horror that's taking place around the characters. All right, so this is covering the basics of Pulp SF, with Hugo Gernsback, and then the readings for today's class with E. Doc Smith's The Skylark of Space and C.L. Moore's Sham Blow in Northwest Smith. So I just want to give you all a reminder again. Make sure that in the coming weeks, take a moment, think about what you want to do for your research project in the class, and email me your idea. Remember, you pick your own science fiction work. It could be a film, it could be a TV series, it could be music, it could be art, it could be a video game, or you may have a few different options and you want to get my ideas on them. That's also fine to email me. Just email that to jellis@citytech.cuny.edu, and then I'll reply and let you know what I think, if I can give you some feedback, some ideas, research help, etc. One thing though, because I've gotten some really great ideas from students so far, but some of the things that I've suggested, I just want to throw out there, is some people have been interested in anthologies. Anthologies are collections of things that aren't necessarily connected together. And one big example that comes up in some of those emails is the anthology TV series, Black Mirror, which is absolutely awesome. I mean, all the stories in it are really thought-provoking, very interesting, quite disturbing in many cases. But the thing that I want to guide you to is, instead of writing a paper on Black Mirror, which is obviously now spanning several seasons and a lot of different stories, is what you need to do is pick one episode of Black Mirror as one option, or a theme of a few different episodes from Black Mirror. Because now there's been so many episodes of Black Mirror, there are certain episodes that have similar themes, like of social media or of interventions in the body or of the brain and mind. So you can choose like that theme and say, well, there's these 3 episodes that all share that same theme that I'm going to write my research paper on. But don't take all of Black Mirror as the subject of your paper. It's way too much to do for what is being asked of you for this project. And also, it's too broad for you to really sink your teeth into it, to say some intelligent things about what you're observing in the work that you've selected. The same is true also for things like Star Trek. Like, you don't want to write your paper on all of Star Trek. It's too big now. But you could choose like maybe the original series of Star Trek. Even better is to choose maybe just an episode of the original series of Star Trek. The same thing would be true of Star Trek The Next Generation. You don't want to write a paper about the whole thing. It's too big. But you could choose an episode, or maybe a connected series of episodes. I'm thinking, for example, of the episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation that feature Data and his brother Lore. There's only a handful of those, but they're all very pivotal and important episodes in the series. But that would give you a theme, a linkage, that you would be able to say, well, these stories are all connected together. So I'm going to use them as the subject of my research paper. So send me those ideas, and I'll get back to you with some feedback on them. Okay. And so discuss homework, this final thing. So again, let's look ahead. For next week, watch Flash Gordon episode 1 and 2, but also use this time, because those episodes are like 30 minutes long. So use this time to maybe watch more Flash Gordon if you're all caught up with the readings. Or if you need to catch up on the readings, this is your opportunity to do that at this point in the semester. Though I'll post a weekly writing assignment. I say here on the syllabus, due by next week, research essay proposal email. I'm still open to receiving those at any point in time, but remember, sooner is better than later. That way it gives you more time to work on this, because I don't want you to wait to the last minute to begin your research for whatever project you're working on, because then you're not just going to have my class to worry about, you got all your other classes to worry about too. So spread things out. Use time management to plan ahead. And so let me know your ideas on that research essay. And then also, if you want, you can always read ahead. We have coming up week 7, Isaac Asimov's Reason and Ray Bradbury's The Fireman. And so with any of these stories that we have coming up, you can read them at any point in time and put those notes in your notebook and save them for when we have the upcoming lecture. That's totally fine as well. I don't want you to think I'm holding you back if you want to go ahead and read some of this stuff if you have the time. Because again, thinking about the end of the semester, the more things you can do now to save yourself work later, your future self will reach back to your past self and pat you on the back and thank you for having that foresight to get some of this stuff done in advance. Also want to remind you guys, this very last thing in today's class, remember to submit your midterm notebooks. Look for this post on our Open Lab site, Midterm Notebook Submission Week 5. Just scroll down a little bit and you'll find it. And again, I've given you links to instructions about how to scan documents using different tools. And then use this link here, submit your notebook PDF on Dropbox here. And that'll be a place that you can upload that saved PDF of your notebooks. That's everything from the beginning of the semester until the midterm. Just copy it all and upload it. That way I can look over your notes, see that you've been making good notes, which I know you all have been, and then you'll get all that credit for that work. Easy enough. And it gives me something to say that you've been working and participating in the class, so I can give a satisfactory grade for you on CUNY First. So make sure you remember to do that if you haven't done so already. And already a few people have, but there's obviously a lot more folks that need to get that in around this time. And if it comes in a little bit late, that's fine. Just remember always, if you turn something in late, email me and just let me know, hey, Professor Ellis, I'm sorry I got that thing turned in late, but if you go check it, it's there now. That lets me know to go check it for you. Okay? So remember, I have office hours Wednesday 3 to 5 p.m. The link is at the top of our syllabus. Just show you here, top of the syllabus. Contact and office hours. Just click that link for Google Hangouts. If you can't meet during that time and you need to talk to me, send me an email letting me know when you're available for the next few days. That way I can find a time between all the things I got to do to when I can meet with you. I respond to email if you have questions that way. And I would just conclude by saying I hope everybody's doing good. Still wear a mask. If you get an opportunity to get a vaccine, by God, take it. You want to protect yourself. You want to protect your family members so that we can try to get out of this mess that we're in right now with the pandemic. And if anything comes up, if God forbid someone gets sick, if you have trouble with your work schedule, with your school schedule, anything that's impacting our class that you want to let me know about, and you don't even have to go into details. If something comes up, just let me know something's come up, and then we'll work together to try to build a path forward for you, okay? I don't want you to think you got to say things that you'd be uncomfortable saying, because again, like I said in the very first lecture, we're all adults, and I trust you guys. But if something comes up, let me know that something is in fact going on and that you and I need to work together to figure out a plan to keep you on track. Because I want everybody in the class watching this lecture to do well. But obviously you got to bring it. And if something is going to stop you from bringing that energy and time and excitement on your part, then let me know so that we can figure out a plan to help reignite things, to get things on track so that you can still bring it and do well in the class by the end of the semester. So good luck, and I will talk to you all again real soon.